Hello, this is Trenton. I just wanted to tell you I just got back from a tournament and I did pretty well in it. I had 3 wins and 2 draws, and one of my wins was against a national master. This is the first time I beat a titled player in an official tournament, and I was going to share this game with you. I was playing with the white pieces. I opened up with d4. This is my repertoire. He goes knight f6, c4, c5. And then so far d5 and then b5. This is the Benko Gambit, and for a long time, I was having a hard time coming up with a good way to fight it. It's because the system gets very complicated. There's, let's see, there's a lot of strange rook maneuvers that white has to know about if he goes into the main line, and then black gets a lot of pressure on the A and B files, and you can easily get into trouble. So after I took that pawn and then I played e3. So I learned this system from John Bartholomew, and I hope he sees this video somehow. It's because this seems to be a promising way for me to fight the Benko Gambit. It simply defends the b5 pawn with the bishop, and it waits for black to release the tension. And it also prepares to reinforce this pawn with moves like a4, knight c3, rook a3 is an important move. So it's simply going to be defending this pawn on b5 rather than helping black develop these queenside pieces. So I hope John Bartholomew knows that I used his system to beat a national master. So he plays g6, knight c3, bishop g7, a4. All of this is theory so far. Castles, knight f3. E6 threw me off a little bit. It's because usually black plays bishop b7 here, but actually this is just a transposition. After rook a3, bishop b7, it transposes to the main line anyway, so I figured that out eventually. So then d takes e6, f takes e6, and the point is that black is now prepared to play this move d5, so white blockades with queen to d6, so black can no longer play d5. And here white has a small advantage. This b5 pawn boxes out this knight on b8, so he can't really do anything. If ever he captures a takes b5, a takes b5, this rook is defended on a3 by the b pawn. So, and then this move is what put me out of book completely. It's knight d5. In my preparation, I thought that the most popular moves were like queen c8 preparing knight e8. So if we open up the opening book, queen c8 is popular, a takes b6 is popular. Knight d5, it's not in this opening database, but I thought that black was supposed to prepare the move knight e8 followed by d5. So I think it's after queen c8, bishop e2. Yeah, knight e8 is the move. White has to play queen g3, and then black eventually tries to play d5. So this was in my preparation, so I didn't know this move knight d5, and this is when I'm out of book finally. And I made my first inaccuracy. It was b takes a6. So the problem with this move is that it helps black to play knight takes a6, and now this knight is no longer boxed out by the b pawn because now it has access to the b4 square or the c7 square. So that's why better would have been to play knight takes d5, and after bishop takes d5, bishop e2, it goes down this forcing line: a takes, rook takes, b takes, queen a5 check. Black regains the pawn, and the point is that after all of this, it's almost equal, but white has a tiny advantage. It's because this knight on b8 is completely boxed in by this one pawn on b5, and the queen blockades the d7 square, so the knight can't go here either. So that's how white's supposed to play if he wants a small advantage, but instead I release the tension, and usually when you release the tension, that gives away your advantage. I see this happening in a lot of my tournament games. I seem to be giving away the tension when I don't need to. But there was a point behind this move, but this point was misguided. So I always have a reason whenever I make a move. Every move I have has a reason behind it. But sometimes my reasoning is flawed, and that's why you can't play perfect chess. And then this is how oversights happen and leads to mistakes. So knight takes a6, and then I played knight takes d5. He played e takes d5, which I believe is an inaccuracy. But I was thinking that after bishop takes d5, I could play bishop a6. Okay, because his knight was left hanging, but black has queen a5 check there, and actually black is slightly better here. So queen a5 check actually regains the piece, and his queen is also stopping me from castling at the moment. So black would be slightly better if that happened. He played e takes d5, and the computer doesn't seem to register this as an inaccuracy, but it does give plus 0.3 for white. And I think that's important because this move, because if bishop takes d5 was played, then he would have had pressure on this f3 knight, and this bishop on d5 would be hitting here in conjunction with this rook. This forces me to play bishop e2, which is more passive. But by playing e takes d5, he opens up this b5 square for my bishop, and I no longer have to passively play bishop e2. I can play an attacking move, bishop b5. And now it's saying plus 0.2 for white, but now this bishop is an attacking piece rather than a defending piece. So I thought this was a small inaccuracy, and I think these little inaccuracies are important even if the computer doesn't register them like that. He played rook f6. I was kind of surprised by that move. What did I think he would do? Maybe try to push in the center with a move like d4 and split open my pawns. Let's see, what are some alternatives for black here? Okay, c4, bishop c6. d4 is actually bad, wow. And it's because e takes d4, rook e8 check, I play king d1. Okay, I did not look at this, I had no idea about this. So, he breaks open the center. I'm forced to play king d1. And this is good for white for some reason. I do not understand this. Okay, I'm shocked that d4 is bad for white, forcing me to go on castle, breaking open the center while my king is stuck in the middle. But somehow this is very good for white. I do not understand that, why d4 was bad. So he played rook f6 instead. Maybe he figured out that d4 is somehow bad. Like I thought that would have been good for black. So queen takes d7, he forces me to capture here and here. My opponent made the critical mistake of the game. He played queen a5 check, and this is the one mistake that cost him the entire game. It's because he needed to trade off the queens, otherwise he's allowing me to develop against his queen with tempo with bishop d2 followed by a5. He's only giving me more tempo to work with. So I was expecting him to play queen takes d7, which is the best move. And then black just brings his knight to c5, and here my opponent probably didn't want to do this because he's down 2 pawns and he's trading queens. In principle, you're supposed to avoid trading material when you're down material. And in this case, it's one of the exceptions. It's because the black queen didn't really have any good squares to go to anyway. But then the black pieces all have very nice squares, like this knight is going to jump into d3 or maybe to b3. So this is one of the exceptions where black needed to trade queens, but he tried to avoid the exchange. And then he ended up being forced back to c7, where the queens get traded off anyway. Rook d6. And the computer said I played pretty well from this point on. I didn't make any serious mistakes. So it was, for the most part, a clean win. My opponent never recovered from that one mistake, queen a5 check. So I trade off the queens after I'm forced to do so. Yeah, usually you're not supposed to release the tension until your opponent forces you to. It's just sometimes I have a hard time telling whether I'm forced to or not. Like I maybe miscalculate something, I overestimate like the problems of keeping the tension. So you want to avoid releasing the tension unless you have to. So in this case, white had to. But the other time when I played b takes a6, I didn't actually have to do that. Oh yeah, and in this position, my opponent offered me a draw. And there's a lot of players who would take a draw against a national master knowing that he's such a strong player and they're worried about messing something up. I knew I was better. I was up 2 pawns. And if I have a titled player offering me a draw, then that's a sign that he's getting kind of desperate. So I played on with bishop e2. my bishop was attacked by that knight. And in this position, my opponent realized that he can't play bishop takes b2 because I have rook b3, and that forks both of these bishops. So he probably deflected. He probably played queen a5 check, thinking that after bishop d2 this b pawn would be hanging because the bishop no longer defends it. But because of this rook on a3 and this bishop on b7, I have this kind of tactic indirectly defending the b2 pawn. So the bishop on d2 is actually well placed supporting the a5 pawn. So bishop d2 actually helps white, but he thought it would hurt white if he provoked that move. That's why he played queen a5 check. But technically, it's actually better for white to have the bishop on d2 because of that tactic right there. So he played bishop c6, trying to get out of this tactic. And this is where I realized that I'm still up 2 pawns, but black has this really strong center. He has this hanging pawn structure. They're controlling all of these squares, and they're making it harder for me to maneuver my pieces. So if I can destroy black's center, then black will have nothing left, and then it should be an easy conversion with 2 extra pawns. So that's why I played b4. This is a common maneuver for attacking the hanging pawn structure. You force this pawn to advance, for example, and it creates all these weak squares that you can occupy with your pieces. Like I can use this square for my bishop. So let's see, after c4, I can play bishop c3 potentially. I can play knight d4. And then I have some good squares opened up for my pieces, and maybe I can even play a rook to d1 and put pressure on this pawn, like it's now a backward pawn. So that's this b4 maneuver is a common idea for undermining the hanging pawn structure. I did a little bit of analysis with the computer. Apparently the cleanest win was also complicated, but it's rook b3, bishop a4, rook b7, knight e6, b4 only now. And the difference is that this rook on a3 was kind of in a bad position before, and now this rook is in a very aggressive position on b7. And if you continue all the way down, eventually you get into this complicated exchange sacrifice, but you ultimately regain the piece because this bishop on a4 had no really good squares to go to. This pawn on, let's see, it's right about, yeah, the rook on a1 is on a good square for supporting this a6 pawn, and eventually white ultimately lands this fork and then has 2 minor pieces versus a rook. So all of that is still very complicated, but apparently that's the cleaner win because this rook on a3, when I played b4 immediately, now this rook is kind of passive. It's stuck behind its own pawns rather than on the opponent's 7th rank. So, but b4 is still winning though. c4, and then I played the follow-up e4. And now, after d takes e4, my plan was successful. I successfully split up these 2 pawns. Now these 2 pawns are permanent weaknesses, and I can attack with moves like bishop c4. I can play rook e1 at some point to target this pawn. So d takes e4 plays right into my hands. So the most complicated way would have been knight b5, which is what I thought he was going to play. And then this leads to another complicated exchange sacrifice line. So yeah, you usually try to keep it simple when you're playing for a win like this, but it seems like in practice, like these complications get kind of unavoidable. Like your opponent can constantly find ways to complicate the position even if he's objectively losing. It's hard to avoid these complications. But after bishop h6, he takes, bishop takes, I take the bishop, he takes a bishop, I take the bishop, c3, knight b3, and then after all of this, white plays b5. And although white sacrificed an exchange, in return I have 3 connected passers, and black has very little he can do about moves like b6, b7, c7, c8, and they're supported by my minor pieces. My rook can maybe get behind these pawns and support them even more. So that would have been a very complicated win. But that's the exchange sacrifice that would ultimately lead to a win for white. So he didn't go for those complications and instead split open these pawns, but that plays right into my hands. I start with bishop f4, which is an important move. So if we turn on the computer, bishop f4 is the only winning move for white. Everything else is bad. It's because this pawn is attacking your knight on f3, so you have to counterattack first. You can't play bishop takes c4 first because he will answer bishop d5, and now you can't play bishop f4 because he will be attacking your bishop on c4. So you have to play bishop f4 first. After rook d7, now bishop takes c4 check, and then bishop d5 was also possible, but then I answered knight d2. I think, yeah, I remember something else I calculated. After bishop d5, I was planning on playing rook d1, which is also winning, but it's more complicated because he's going to put his rook over here. I trade off some pieces, and now it becomes very complicated. If he takes by this rook, for example, knight d2 only now to defend the back row. So I was planning on rook d1, which is also winning, but let me see. Yeah, even better was just knight d2 immediately, just defending the bishop. So no need to go for those complications, but he played knight d5 in the game. Now knight e5 is a pretty beautiful fork. It just attacks both of these. It also gets out of this attack by the pawn. So it forces black to give up the fianchettoed bishop. Okay, so I now have the dark squared bishop. He attacks it, and the rest of this is pretty easy. So he plays rook b8, attacking the b4 pawn. Bishop c5 defends. King g7. He unpins this knight and therefore attacks the b4 pawn. So I give up the bishop. And now I just start pushing my pawns on the queen side. He attacks my rook on f1, but I have a counterpunch with a7. Rook a8, rook e1, getting out of the attack. Rook d7. And now an important move, h3, so I can't take this pawn immediately. Like, this would be awful if it actually happened. Like, if I actually took this pawn, and then black just delivers checkmate like this. Like, this would just be awful. Like, I played such a good game, so you gotta look out for back rank threats like those. So I went with h3. Part of the reason is that black has a light squared bishop, so it can only control, like, the g3 square, for example. So if I play g3, maybe black can control this square with his light squared bishop somehow. But with h3, it's now on a dark square, so the bishop can't control that square, so this is a very reliable left square. So h3, bishop d3, he now defends. Rook a5, I'm preparing b5, b6. Rook b7, so he stops me. So I played rook e3, I went for a different plan now. My idea is to undermine this bishop with f3, and then I can finally get my rook into the game, like maybe rook d7 after I get that pawn out of the way. Or rook e7 rather. And then I should be able to win it from there after I undermine that bishop. So he played rook b5, and it just gets worse and worse. So it looks like maybe black is trying to create a fortress by transposing into an opposite colored bishop ending, but this doesn't really work for him because, first of all, I capture this third pawn, and then because this rook is still on the board, there's nothing that black can do to stop these pawns from coming through. Here's just the end of the game. I attack the bishop, rook b7. Yeah, and in this position, I just made one oversight. I put my opponent in check without realizing it. It's because I was so fixated on what was happening on the queen side and pushing these pawns through that I forgot that this rook was also looking over here. So I was pretty excited about winning the game, and then I just made that one quick oversight, realizing that I was completely winning on the queen side, so I neglected the king side. So I put my opponent in check without realizing it. Hence, I was confused by king f7. But then after b5, b6, and then in this position my opponent just resigned. It's because there's nothing he can do about b7. For example, I'm going to play b7, and then rook b8. That forces black to give up the two pieces for the pawns, and then it's just going to, this is just a very trivial win. It can be a rook versus king checkmate, or I can just simply pick up these pawns with my other rook. I might not even have to do that. So a pretty simple win from there, and that's why he resigned after b6. There's nothing black can do here. So I told I told my family about how I beat a national match for the first time in an official over the board. They were pretty happy about my progress, and I ended up gaining a lot of points from this tournament too because I beat some strong players. So I gained 82 rating points from that tournament, and I got some good prize money at the end of it too because I had 3 wins and 2 draws. But this, let's see. Oh, I do remember one other thing that was a problem during this tournament. It's that I had a lot of painful anxiety, and what happened was the anxiety was so bad it was causing me stomach problems, and I had a nervous bladder, so I was running to the bathroom a lot. So I'm trying to figure out how to get my anxiety under control so that I can play even better. So if I wasn't so anxious and I could focus even better on these games, then I would play even better than I did in these 3 wins. Um, and the fatigue started setting in for the 3rd day of the tournament for rounds 4 and 5. So I usually start playing worse towards the end of the tournament. That's when fatigue starts setting in. So I got to figure out how to deal with fatigue and anxiety. And if I do that, then I should be able to perform even better than I did in this tournament. So I hope you enjoyed that analysis, and I hope John Bartholomew sees that I successfully used his system against a national master. So thank you for watching.